Welcome to CIC number 10. I'm Dennis Hollingsworth. This week I went to an event hosted by the Emily Harvey Foundation titled In Advance. The speakers at the event were Jeremy Johnson, who's a curator and founding member of Darling Green, which I don't know much about. It was my first contact with this gentleman. And he was in conversation with Thierry de Duve. And Thierry de Duve is a writer, critic, professor at Hunter College. He lives both here in New York and in Brussels. And it was quite interesting, not only because Duchamp is the topic of their discussion, but also that in the background, MoMA has a show up now on Marcel Duchamp. And that should be very interesting. I haven't seen it yet, but I'm looking forward to. So Thierry de Duve, Duchamp's Telegram. It's a book that I bought a few years ago and liked it a great deal, mainly because I have a kind of pet picture theory of art history. And not that, let's say the best way to say it is that de Duve parallels, or at least is somewhat along the lines of my thinking already, which I'll sketch out for you really fast right now. Basically, the way I see it, with the advent of modernism in the middle of the 19th century, under the weight of all the inventions and new technology coming online, such as railroad, telegraph, bicycles, cars, later on in war, not too much later on in war, tanks and gas and terrible things, which this continues on today with the advent of drone warfare, which is altering the battlefield a great deal in terrifying ways. But modernity changed civilization altogether, of course, and in its wake was the demise of classicism. And at that moment, at the dawn of the 20th century, maybe a decade beforehand, I believe came to rise a kind of Janus-headed double aspect of modernity. One which wanted to reconstruct a modernism or a canon that was appropriate to modernism, to incorporate all those elements that the old classicism wouldn't deal with. Now, I come from an architectural background, and this is where some of my ideas started to form, and sort of coming to understand the impact of engineering, of reinforced concrete, of the ability for buildings to span much longer than timbers would or arching brick will allow, forced a new vocabulary onto the arts, and not just architecture, but everything. And with this impact, which I think in terms of acceleration and velocity, at the turn of the century, the 20th century, the acceleration must have felt exhilarating and scary, and all sectors of society responded to it, somewhat embracing it, somewhat rejecting it. But the arts at that time, at least what I'm distinguishing between, I'll call a modern and postmodern, problematic names, but let's handle it nonetheless. The modern tried to create a canon, whereas what became known as postmodern was anti-canon. It didn't want these categories and rules to order their world. They didn't want this bit of an anarchistic kind of impulse, I think. And earliest progenitors of this, I would say exemplars of this, would be Alfred Jarry at the time, where shortly after Picasso was painting. That sort of impish, anarchic kind of energy, I think later on translated cleanly into Duchamp's generation. Now, the modern developed until under the weight of its achievements in abstract expressionism came to a place of kind of exhaustion. The modern tried to touch God through material means, and you can't touch God or you get extinguished. And along this storyline, it's no surprise for me that Rothko would seek his own end, and Pollock too, in a way, through a drunken car accident, or de Kooning, who lived on but lived debilitated by alcoholism, a kind of self-immolation in a sense. And that young artist at the far edge of that epoch, I would imagine young Johns and Rauschenberg, for example, were looking around them and they were thinking, well, we can't add any more to this story. And so the result was a flipping, an inversion of the narrative. Instead of touching God through material means, they were pointing, not touching, to everyday life, not God, through conceptual, not material means. And from that came the initially pop, and then through minimalism, and then conceptualism. These are rude categories, I know, but bear with me here. It was a constant dialing down of materialism until you got to the zenith of this story, which would be Solo Witt and his wall drawings, which were essentially sets of instructions, which I think was his achievement, to realize art in a purely conceptual sense, that art could be a simple set of instructions executed by others, not necessarily by the artist. Afterwards was a kind of spreading out without that any higher zenith to achieve, a kind of grand et cetera of conceptualizations ensued up until this day, through identity, through a multitude of other topics, ecology, things like that. But what you also have is a sort of spreading river delta, where the river was once dew dropping from the leaves of trees on mountains, forming streams and creeks, coming together into rivers that would run fast and then slower and slower and then dirtier and dirtier. I think we're at the delta, well, we've been at the delta phase, fanning out, evaporating, and I would say somewhat critically stinking. And sometimes stinking would be a good thing, given different artists like in the past Mike Kelly or Pettibone, who've profited a great deal from the stink of these end times. But we have reached a kind of the ocean in a certain sense. We're oozing out in the ocean, and hopefully we're evaporating. Maybe not to form clouds to go back to a mountain, but to form the end of to realize the end of this cycle and crystallize into another one. Hopefully, because in this already 25 plus years into the 21st century, it's high time that we stop living in the shadow of the 20th. Okay, so with that said, I bought Duchamp's Telegram a few years ago, devoured the book, and I'm going to attempt right now a quick synopsis of his argument that was presented. I think Duve is saying that Duchamp is the messenger, but not the originator, not the sort of 0.0 patient of what became known as the postmodern era. He is a messenger because the cause, the driving force was that became this alternate side of modernism, postmodernism, came to being during the collapse of the Beaux-Arts Academy in 1880. France had a series of salons where artists were juried into. And the French Salon was seemingly arbitrary in their rules of admission, which prompted the rise in 1863 of the Salon des Refusés and the erasure of admission criteria. Beaux-Arts system collapsed, as I said, in 1880. In 1884, the French Society of Independent Artists formed, which carried on into the early 20th century. And many of the great names, Cézanne and Matisse and stuff like that, were active in this society. So fast forward to 1913 in the Armory Show in New York City, where Duchamp was introduced to the public. In 1917, the New York Society of Independent Artists formed in opposition to juried exhibitions of the National Academy of Design with the motto, "No jury, no prizes." And the reasons why Duchamp submitted the urinal are not clear, which gives rise to much speculation. And Duve's book does a great job in sussing out all manners of ways to wrap your head around the motivations for his submission to the exhibition. But it was rejected. And in being rejected, it called it highlighted the basic problem that really came into being with the collapse of the Salon system, the Salon de Refusés, which had no criteria, and that would be the root of everything that became what he calls non-art or art in general, which means art outside of the categorical systems, the old classical categorical systems. It's interesting to me that on this page that he includes the painting by Paul de la Roche, which included, seated in the center of the painting, the three figures of classical arts, which would be Ictinus, the architect, the painter Apelles, and the sculptor Phidias. And between those three categories, no intermediate category was even conceived of. But after the erasure of admission criteria in the Salon de Refusés was the crack, which later on Duchamp exploded with his urinal fountain at the New York Society of Independent Artists exhibition. Later on in the exhibition, they speak of Marcel Broodthaers, an artist that was exhibiting in the early 60s, a former poet. They describe him as a failed poet, but I don't like that characterization. But applied his energy from poetry, transferred it to art. And basically his achievement was to take on the persona of the museum director in this sort of fictional museum exhibited within a museum eventually. And this is a show that I had seen in California back in the 90s, and it was, I wouldn't say it's mind-blowing because I just come out of art school and we were steeped in ideas that were consequent to the achievements of people like Broodthaers and Duchamp in the 60s. So interesting in their telling that Duchamp basically, in a kind of 40-year interregnum in his career, where he was basically working in the shadows, even though he was well supported by the Arnenbergs and other collectors, he had a very strong support base, and yet he was in the shadows because during this period, from his show in 1917 until the late 50s, early 60s, painting had to work itself out. And as it culminated into the Abex touching God kind of moment and extinguishing itself as a result. In this period, basically, Duchamp was, in a way, creating a museum for himself, and the museum in a suitcase in the valise. And he was, in a way, prefiguring what Broodthaers would do later on. And by reincorporating and historicizing himself in his work and folding that back in conceptually, he preserved himself during that interregnum and was able to blossom in the retrospective in the Pasadena Museum in 1963. So it's all very interesting. I found it fascinating. When I go to events like this, I generally take notes. And I've been doing that ever since I got to New York in 2012. I got a kind of catalog of these notes. You can find these notes in my weblog at dennishollingsworth.us. I just posted them up, and you can read the notes of the evening for yourselves. Yeah, so it was a great evening. If you love Duchamp, you would love these notes at least, and I'm looking forward to seeing the show at MoMA. Should be very, very interesting.